Why are they making me talk about Congress today? Why? It's Thanksgiving. Come on. Congress is off. It's reconvening next week, and I guess the issue is when Congress gets back, basically the end of November, beginning of December. It's got a lot to do in a short amount of time. Not only are lawmakers trying desperately to pass a tax bill by a self-imposed deadline of Christmas, but it's also got to figure out a way to fund the government beyond a December 8th deadline. So how are they going to get it all done? I want to bring in CNBC editor-at-large John Harwood and Jared Bernstein, MSNBC contributor and former chief economist for Vice President Biden. These are two guys we lean on a lot to just help make sense of stuff, and I appreciate that, and I'm thankful that you guys are around for us. And I'm making an effort today not to make things political, just to try and explain a few things. John, a number of people have implied that this very strong stock market that we're in, again setting records this past week, is strong in part because it's counting on Congress to pass this tax bill in order to keep the good times rolling. Give me your thoughts on that.
First of all, I want to clarify one thing, Ali. Are you saying you're not thankful for Congress?
I'm very thankful for Congress. What would I talk about all the time if there wasn't Congress?
All right, very good. Look, it is very difficult to disentangle effects in the stock market. We certainly saw the stock market go up after President Trump was elected, but my colleagues who cover the stock market in intimate detail at CNBC seem to think that the stock market now is not necessarily tied to tax cuts itself, that whatever benefit would come from a tax cut is already baked into the stock market. It's mostly about the global economic recovery. So there may not be the downside that Steve Mnuchin has talked about if Congress fails to pass tax reform.
Jared, let me ask you this. I never want to discount the stock market. As you know, I've been a stock market reporter since the beginning of my career. I used to do a show from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I enjoy the stock market. I'm glad when people make money out of it. And I fully get that just because a person isn't invested in the stock market doesn't mean that there's no benefit to a rising stock market. So put into perspective for me, as we continue and as this president continues to tout the stock market, that about half of all Americans own stock. Most of them are not active holders of stock. It's through their 401ks. Right. But in total, about half of all Americans own stock. How should everybody be thinking about a stock market that continues to go up?
It's an important question for reasons I'll get into, but first of all, while about half of people own stock, you have to look at how much stock they own. Most people own very little, so 80% of the value of the stock market is held by the richest 10% of families, and 40% of the value of the stock market is held by the top 1%. So when the stock market goes up a lot, the folks who benefit from that wealth effect tend to be among those who are most wealthy. Now, here's the thing in where I think the stock market's uptick recently has been most relevant. One of the reasons, I kind of agree with John on this, one of the reasons that the stock market is doing well is not because of the tax cuts. That's priced in, like John said. It's because corporate earnings have been really quite strong, persistently so. Corporate profitability is near an all-time high. So I ask you, why does the middle class have to pay for a bunch of tax cuts for the corporate sector? The corporate sector, especially the multinational sector, is already kind of crushing it, and yet we have this tax plan that takes from the middle and gives to the top. That doesn't make any sense.
So, John, help me make sense of that, because, again, there's no reason why we shouldn't want companies to make money, but there's an expectation amongst people who work for a living that when there's this kind of largesse and there's relatively good growth and interest rates are low and corporate profitability is so high, we haven't seen the same pattern with wages for many years. We've seen small, slow growth. So if you're in the vast middle of wage earners, you're not sharing in this remarkably successful corporate environment that we've had.
That's right, and it begs the question of if wage increases depend on corporations doing well, why hasn't that happened? Now, part of the argument from the administration and Republican leaders in Congress is if we slash corporate taxes, that money is going to benefit workers. The standard, and Jared knows this better than I do, but a rough standard in economic analysis is that about a quarter of corporate tax cuts would benefit workers and the rest would benefit owners of businesses. The administration is arguing that that's reversed, that the vast bulk of this benefit would go to workers and not business owners. I would say that even with that assumption, I was talking to the Tax Foundation the other day, very aggressive, dynamic scoring of the tax plan. Even with this assumption, we're still talking about a tax plan that gives a vastly disproportionate amount of money to people at the top and doesn't generate all that much economic growth, under 3% in the Tax Foundation's analysis.
Let's look at economic growth. Actually, I'm going to ask my producers to put up a screen that has economic growth compared to other countries. Not this one. This is effective tax rates, which is actually good, and I like it. But if I could just ask them to put up the GDP one, that would be good. Because back in September, a number of economists predicted that the U.S. would achieve economic growth in the 2 to 3% range next year. That's lower than a lot of other countries, Jared. And I don't know how fixable that is. I think we'd all like to get to 3% economic growth, but when you see where China is and where India is and places like that, that are economies that can grow faster than a sort of a, how do you describe America? Like sort of a middle-aged, slightly overweight man. It's not, we're not that nimble.
Hey, who are you talking about here?
Me. How do we get there? I don't disagree with the president. I do disagree with the president, who last summer was still saying 4 and 5 and 6% economic growth. I think that's nonsense. But maybe if we could try to get to 3, that would still be roughly a jump from where we are.
First of all, before we get a bunch of letters to the editor here, let me point out that in the last 2 quarters, annualized growth of GDP has been about 3%.
Right.
But that's not the trend. The trend is around 2, maybe a bit north of 2 now. I think thus far over this expansion, the average GDP growth has been around 2.2%.
Right.
Now, you teed it up exactly correctly in my view. This is not some lever that anybody knows how to pull. The combination of labor force growth and productivity growth is what sets the economy speed limit. And there are a bunch of things that go into that, including our aging demographics.
Right.
So the problem is, because economists don't really know what makes productivity speed up or slow down, you have what I call the empty hole problem in economics. I think Harwood will recognize this. This is the idea that when nobody really knows what to do, you get to say your favorite thing to fill up the hole. So it's tax cuts for the rich, it's get rid of the estate tax, or if you're on the other side, it's build a bunch of infrastructure. I happen to think that investing in people, in human capital, in public capital is a great idea. But even I don't believe that's going to move us from 2 to 3%, maybe, 0.2, 0.1, something in that neighborhood. And that would be good to do. But disbelieve anyone who tells you that they can double the growth rate or anything crazy like that.
Yeah. So, John, let me ask you that about the growth rate, because we want to get there. But I think every president, no matter what party you're from, would like to have low unemployment, a good stock market, and high growth. This isn't partisan. In other words, if it were easy to do, lots of people would have done it. It is certainly easier to achieve these bumps in growth when certain things happen over time. If one goes to war, for instance, or we're building the interstate highway system or whatever. When I speak to a lot of people, they say, when you look back to 1950, our long-term economic growth is much higher than this long-term 2%-ish that we see right now. But we were doing remarkable things back then. We were fixing the world. We were building highways. We were electrifying the world.
We had much higher tax rates, by the way.
And
just
we had
FYI.
much higher tax rates. So, John, what's the answer? Because, again, without trying to be political or partisan here, what is the way in which we goose our economy? And I'm going to put that graphic up again to show you that the United States, Russia, the EU, and Brazil all have similar growth rates. It's not like anybody's got some magic bullet here.
Exactly right. And look, it's the factors that Jared talked about. It's labor supply and productivity. The other thing that happened during the post-war boom that was so robust is we had a surge of women into the workforce that enabled the economy to increase output. So it is not at all clear how we can speed it up. And there's a debate between, does money go to capital, or does money go to physical capital, or money go to human capital? And Jared and others have argued that we need to invest in both infrastructure and also human capital. Republicans have a different view. But as I said, even when you take how the Tax Foundation scores this Senate bill, yes, there is a short-term surge of growth. They project a 3% growth rate in 2018. But that's the only year of 3% growth. Those longer-term trends kick in after that. And so even under the tax plan, the strongest advocates say it will produce growth in the 2% plus range that Jared was talking about.
And I just want to say something about this. So, and John said this earlier, but I want to underscore it. He's quoting the Tax Foundation. They're the most kind of optimistic about this dynamic scoring of the tax plan. Their model, I consider it to be pretty juiced relative to some more standard issue models. So we don't have the CBO or the JCT, the more standard scores yet, but we do have the Tax Policy Center and the Wharton School dynamic score. They come in way below the numbers John's been citing, and I think they're probably more accurate.
Just to be clear, when we talk about dynamic scoring, this is important because when you tell somebody, well, hey, when you look at this thing, the outcome is not what the president likes to say it's going to be, and the president says, oh, but we're going to have amazing growth. Everybody is going to, companies are going to feel flush, and people are going to feel flush, and everybody's going to spend. That's what dynamic scoring is. It's taking into account the actual effects of it, not just the mathematical effects. John, I want to get back to you for a second. You had a conversation with Senator Lamar Alexander, who, by the way, was a bright hope in something that was going to be done about health care until the president sort of squashed that. You had a chat with him about President Trump. Let's listen.
The president does things and says things that I don't do and that I don't approve of.
Is he dangerous?
I'm not going to sit here and say he's a dangerous man. He's a man that the American people entrusted with the president, and I'm going to try to help him succeed.
John, that is version 19 of the kind of answer that Republicans often have to give when faced with the reality that the president doesn't help them advance the goals they've got in Congress, the goals of governing for the American people.
Think about how extraordinary it is, Ali. You have a senior Republican senator, somebody who twice ran for president himself, was a very credible candidate, being asked if a president of his own party is dangerous, and he does not say no. That tells you about the world we're living in right now.
Guys, a pleasure to have spent this time with you. Thank you so much for it. It's nice to have a little chance for the conversation to breathe. John Harwood and Jared Bernstein. Have yourselves an amazing Thanksgiving. Thanks, guys.